Federal Reserve called for banks to consider climate risks. They actually got pushback from Republicans in Congress, but it's the impact economically is enormous, with threats to the insurance and mortgage markets and pension funds and other financial institutions. And if you remember one thing from this, a study came out a few weeks ago showing that the 2018 wildfires that destroyed Paradise and other parts of Northern California resulted in $150 billion in damages. Just that 1 year's worth of fires. It's about 2/3 of our annual budget in California. Another study shows $80 billion of damages in 2019. Who knows what the 2020 damages will be? But if we are losing in damages and in a direct cost to human life, to our society, this enormous amounts, we need to invest up front to make a difference. And we know that when we invest up front, like $80 billion invested in California can generate 750,000 jobs. We know that investments in clean energy generate more than twice the jobs as in fossil fuels. We have to start taking a risk now to reduce much greater risk later. Another study showed that 9 of 15 global tipping points are underway now. There's a domino effect that could lead to an uninhabitable hothouse climate if we don't act soon. These tipping points were first identified about 10 years ago. They thought that the activation of these tipping points would not occur until 2040 or 2050. And they were very surprised to see that so many are already in the early stages. We can reverse this. One of the authors of that is Johann Rockström from Germany. He said, we've underestimated the risks of unleashing irreversible change. We're seeing strong evidence already for declaring a state of planetary emergency. We do not want to push the on buttons of runaway global warming. The next decade is our window, with consequences for all future generations. One more study. This just came out 2 weeks ago. And Paul Ehrlich is one of the authors here from Stanford, but I think it's from 17 leading scientists across the world. Their conclusion is that humanity is causing a rapid loss of biodiversity, and with it, Earth's ability to support complex life. But the mainstream is having difficulty grasping the magnitude of this loss, despite the steady erosion of the fabric of human civilization. There have been so many warnings from scientists, and we're not acting fast enough. Several of the studies they cited show that 70% of the Earth's land surface has been altered by people. The monitored vertebrate populations have declined by over 68% just in the last 5 decades. And their conclusion is that we have to have fundamental changes to global capitalism, education, and equality, and a rapid exit from fossil fuel use, a strict regulation of markets and property acquisition, rein in corporate lobbying, and the empowerment of women globally. So you hear all this news and you think, oh my God, what can we do about it? Well, we can make a big difference. And you know, the climate, it is true that the climate and environmental reality is outpacing outdated science and policy. But there are some exciting changes that are happening in the world, and leaders are starting to step up. And they're stepping up because people like you who are attending tonight and are active in the Golden Gate Audubon Society are making a difference. And we have much more to do, but we're starting to get our voices heard. So first, Governor Newsom on September 11th, 2 days after that Orange Sky Day, announced that we are in a climate, he actually said we are in a climate dam emergency. Our goals are inadequate and we have to fast track those goals. He's done a couple of things, but I would say the moment spoke to him and a lot more follow-up needs to be done. We have a new executive order for zero emission vehicle car sales by 2035, 100%. I think that's too late. He has another executive order that is to protect 30% of our land and waters by 2030. I'm excited by that. I think it goes in the right direction, but for the whole country, that would be great. For California, we have a lot of protected lands and waters. It's much more how we manage it for biodiversity, for holding more water, for sequestering carbon and sustaining life as we know it. And the bottom line is that California is behind. There are new international and proposed national climate targets that are just outpacing us. The European Union recently committed to cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. California's law by 2030 is 40% below 1990 levels. They are significantly ahead of us. The United Kingdom, under the conservative leader, Boris Johnson, agreed in December to cut greenhouse gas emissions to 68% below 1990 levels by 2030. And they're committing to 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2030, not 2035. President Biden, I used to have to say President-elect, I can now say President Biden has committed to, one of his policy pillars is as having greenhouse gas free electricity across the whole country by 2035. Current California law only calls for 60% renewable electricity by 2030. It's not enough. He's also calling for net zero energy use for new buildings by 2030. California is on a path towards that, but we need to do much more. And one other proposal is from the Senate Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where they came out with a report last August recommending that the country invest 2% annually of the gross domestic product in climate solutions, with 40% of that going to low-income communities. If we applied that to California, that would mean $64 billion. And there's just nothing at that level of investment that's happening between public and private investment. That's as the economy as a whole. We have a lot more to do. California has been a leader on climate change in the past, and many people around the country and the world still think that we are, but we have fallen behind. We need to regain that leadership for climate, for environmental protection, for biodiversity, for our future, because when we lead, it makes a difference. Others follow us. We were one of the first states, actually we were the first state in 2002 to implement policies around reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cars. Within a few years, other states adopted it, and then after that, the country adopted it. We also have helped to get other countries to adopt more aggressive climate policies, but now we need to do more. And so we have decided at the Climate Center, working with many partners across the state, that we should target California, that even with a more progressive government in Washington, D.C., that they will be looking to California as the demonstration project, the pilot project for the country and for the world. We've been that way in the past and we have to do it again, but we'll need to really accelerate more aggressive policies. So we call our campaign Climate Safe California, a campaign for rapid decarbonization. Our overarching goal is that by 2025, California will have enacted the bold policies required by science to dramatically cut emissions, start drawdown, and secure resilient communities by 2030, inspiring global action. So what does that actually mean? Here's the 1990 levels of emissions, this red bar. The zero line is down here. This is what we have recently been celebrating, that we have gotten to below 1990 levels. You can see it's below, but we have a long way to go. This bar here shows 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and that gets us to 259 million metric tons. It's still too much of annual emissions. What we're proposing is that we need to get something like this. It's a combination of dramatic emissions cuts. This shows doubling our current 2030 goals to get to 80% below these 1990 levels. So that leaves us at under 100 million metric tons of annual emissions still, but it is paired with a major investment in nature-based sequestration on natural and working lands, which includes habitat restoration and application of compost on agricultural lands, managing cattle in different ways so that we can really sequester carbon and sustain biodiversity while also ensuring food security and creating jobs, and actually also water security. And with this, you end up with the beginning of what we call net negative emissions. So this pale blue bar here shows minus 14 million metric tons a year, where you have drawdown has begun, you've cut emissions dramatically, and you begin growing this net negative emissions here. So another way of looking at it is by sector in California. These are the main sectors that emissions are measured by the state of California: in agriculture and forestry, buildings, electricity, the industrial sector, and transportation. These are enormous cuts that we have to undertake, but we can do it. And this shows, again, getting to around 100 million metric tons sequestered, paired with massive reductions in each of these sectors. So we can do it. We have the ability, we have the technological know-how, we have the traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous peoples. We have to apply it at scale. So our policies are to accelerate existing state policies from 2050 to 2030 and from 2045 for net negative emissions to 2030. So what does that really look like? First, I want to explain that our overall guiding principles for climate safe California, for them to be successful and to really achieve the kind of vibrant, equitable future that we want, we have to follow these three principles in everything that we do. One is that the science, the policies have to be based on the latest science. It's changing rapidly. We have to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, meaning for the workers and their families and their communities who are dependent on fossil fuel production in California. We need to show a path for them to be able to still take care of their families and have health care and have their pension funds. If we don't have that, we will have significant challenges. We're talking about tens of thousands of workers who are directly employed by fossil fuels in fossil fuel industries, and maybe another 100,000 that are indirectly employed. And third, we have to prioritize climate justice. And we at the Climate Center believe that climate justice is racial justice. We have to ensure that lower income communities and BIPOC communities of color, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are no longer disproportionately harmed by fossil fuels and by climate change impacts, and that they have equitable access to climate-friendly solutions and incentive programs. That is not happening today. The types of policies required to reach net negative emissions by 2030, we have to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuel development, production, and use. We have to scale up that nature-based sequestration so that annually we are sequestering much more than we are today. We have to invest in community resilience. The impacts of climate change are growing, including clean energy, microgrids, and storage, and we need to fund this. Right now, the state of California has been giving a couple million, maybe a year. We need something much greater, more like 12 to 20 billion a year is what we estimate, and then leveraging private sector funds. So I have a lot more detailed policy. I'm going to go through this quickly so that we have more time for discussion, but in this first section, the kinds of policies we're talking about are immediately halting new oil and gas drilling permits. Like, why would we give a permit today to something that's going to last for 30 or 40 years? We should not be expanding oil and gas drilling. We should be plugging abandoned wells. We should establish a health and safety buffer zone from current oil and gas drilling. In Southern California mostly, but in the Central Valley as well, and other parts of the state, we have 7 million Californians that live within 1 mile of oil and gas wells. They are exposed daily to carcinogens that are leaking from there. And many of these wells also leak methane. And so we need to start closing these wells down and moving them away from where people live. And of course, we want to get to 100% greenhouse gas free, decentralized electricity with backup energy storage by 2030. And we have the capability of doing that. We need the political will. Transportation is the biggest source of measured emissions in California. We need to start phasing out fossil fuel powered vehicles, buying cash for clunkers kind of programs, buying gas powered vehicles that are older, making sure there are no new gas powered vehicle registrations by 2030, investing 80% of Caltrans money in non-greenhouse gas emitting sustainable modes of transportation. Right now, 80% of their funds or more are for sustaining freeways. And we don't need to do that anymore. We need to start changing our priorities. We need to invest in affordable housing near jobs, and we need to invest in clean mass transit. And we have to increase the zero emission vehicle charging infrastructure. I won't go into too much detail on this. We have to electrify buildings. Buildings are 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We have over 20 cities now that have enacted methane gas bans for new buildings. We need to do a lot more. There is a new effort right now for getting to 100% electric new buildings by 2022. we need to do it for older buildings as well. We need to really be thinking to electrify everything. And that will take us a big step forward to addressing climate change and making a difference for wildlife and biodiversity. The second key area is increasing sequestration. As I talked about, we believe that we think we can actually add much more than 100 million metric tons, but this will require, just to get to 100 million metric tons, about $3 billion a year over 10 years, $30 billion a year, $30 billion in total. And again, if we think of that figure for what the cost of the fires were in 2018, 150 billion, 30 billion for healthy soils and forests and vegetation that sustain biodiversity, that holds more water, that replenishes groundwater, that gives us healthy food. I mean, that sounds like a bargain to me. But again, we have to have the political will to spend the money this way. And then we know how to do it. We know how to do carbon farming and carbon gardening. It's not just for rural areas. We can do this in urban areas. We know how to do climate smart habitat restoration and management on land, on the coast, and we can enhance protected habitats. There's much more we can do with carbon farm planning alone on 20 million acres. With riparian restoration, we have huge potential. In the Central Valley, 95% of riparian or streamside habitat has been lost. If we restore even a fraction of that, we will have so many benefits for clean water, for fish, for birds, for other wildlife, for flood reduction, to be more resilient to heat extremes, and to sequester more carbon. This is such a win-win for everybody that it would be a shame not to take advantage of this moment to invest at scale. We at the Climate Center have a draft sequestration bill that we are temporarily calling the Climate Restoration and Food Security Act. And again, I won't go into details on it, but the potential to scale this up would have incredible benefits for the protection of our natural resources in our state while simultaneously addressing the climate crisis. And third, we need to invest in community resilience. As climate impacts worsen, we need to ensure that everybody is able to be supported through emergencies, fires, smoke, floods. It's hard to imagine floods right now, but they will come again and they will be severe when we have them. And we need to ensure that every city has the funding and the support to do this. And that when we have these power outages, whether they are planned by utilities or they're unplanned, that we have clean energy community microgrids run by local communities, including electric vehicles as a way of storing that power overnight, and starting with critical facilities in lower income communities. So we have a vision for creating a decentralized and integrated power grid that allows these different centers to create their own islands of power. So when power goes out in one place, it doesn't mean all these other places have to lose electricity. And it essentially is this vision of thousands of local electricity systems linked over a macro grid. We are very strong in, we're working with a number of different communities across California to ensure that the microgrid policies prioritize clean energy resilience for communities that suffer most from air pollution and power outages. And some of you might be familiar with CalEnviroscreen that shows where the lowest income communities are. And these are the ones that are also most impacted by air pollution and by fossil fuel use and production. There are other really creative ideas like scaling up mobile storage. As I mentioned, we can do it with an electric vehicle in your driveway. The California school bus fleet, there's an effort by the World Resources Institute that we are exploring this and doing a project in California with them. We have 24,000 school buses in California. If we made all of them electric instead of diesel, first of all, we clean up air pollution in those communities, but we would also store about 1/4 of the peak energy needs in California, so that when we have those heat extremes or fires, we don't have to lose electricity in the evening. We can actually use the batteries from these buses to bring back in electricity back into the grid and also provide cleaner air for everybody. So just some of the kinds of things that are possible. We have 2 bills that we're working on in the state around microgrid development in disadvantaged communities. And I can give you more information on that another time if you'd like. And the 4th pillar is funding climate action, as I mentioned. There are many ways to get to this, and it will certainly require all of these approaches, from regulatory changes that open up markets, that send market signals and allow private companies to pay for much of what's needed, and also to ensure that we expedite the use of federal green stimulus funds, which we do expect to get under the Biden administration. There are all kinds of possibilities, like a per passenger fee that could raise over $2 billion a year in California. It requires efforts with the federal government to make that happen. There's a new ballot measure proposed for 2022 to raise $30 billion for climate action on transportation and other sectors. We need to have progressive carbon fees. There's a whole concept of fee baits that reverses that, green climate bonds, and closing tax loopholes. So all kinds of creative ways to get there. Again, we need the political will. The suite of solutions and technologies exist today for California to enact now. With Climate Safe California, I just want to share that we have over 800 endorsements to date from electeds and scientists and businesses, NGOs. We would love for the Golden Gate Audubon Society to endorse, and for each of you individually too. You can go to climatesafeca.org to endorse, as we have a number of opinion leaders who've endorsed, including Terry Tamminen, who was the former California EPA secretary under Governor Schwarzenegger and was a lead author of the initial climate efforts in California under AB 32. And as he said, I strongly endorse the goal of Climate Safe California to achieve net negative emissions by 2030. 2050 is too late. The campaign's focus on science, urgency, and policy is exactly what's needed, and California must lead the way. The bottom line is our house is on fire, really, truly, literally. And we need to ask at every level of society, are we doing enough? The answer right now is no. We have to do much, much more, much faster. So I ask you to join Terry Tamminen and 800 others in endorsing Climate Safe California, a public pledge of support for California to accelerate aggressive climate policy, inspiring states and other countries to greater action for a climate safe Earth. And with that, we need to, some of the things that we can do, we need to urge the governor and the legislature to declare a state formally of climate emergency. It's one thing to say at a press conference, it's a climate damn emergency. It's another thing to really act on it. We need them to act on it. There's so many things. They could appoint a cabinet level climate czar. And you think about all the positions that President Biden has appointed to directly address climate in every sector. We're not doing that even in California. We need to do it. And we need to demand new legislation, new executive orders to achieve net negative emissions, to protect and restore habitats at scale, to enact these other required policies, and to secure the needed funding. Other kinds of actions, we can do Zoom house meetings about these issues, and maybe some of you are already doing it. If you're interested in doing that, I can provide information to you. You can engage locally with your city council and your county supervisors to endorse Climate Safe California. To send a letter from those elected local bodies to the governor and to state elected officials to accelerate climate action timelines. You can work with them to develop and implement and fund community energy resilience plans and climate action plans, including changing building codes. You can divest and invest for a climate safe future and take all kinds of personal actions. Of course, you can go to our website and it's available in so many places for the kinds of things you can do. We have choices. Here's what would have happened at Marin Headlands if it hadn't been for a group of women who got active in the early 60s. Or here, we could have had San Francisco Bay filled in if it weren't for them. But we made different decisions in the 1960s and since then. We need to do that today. One person has made an enormous difference, Greta Thunberg, and lots of people make an even bigger difference. We have Exxon is no longer in the Dow. The peak oil, some people believe, has already happened. So we're already moving in the right direction. We just have to go a lot faster. Solar is now the cheapest form of power globally. It's incredible. No one would have thought that 15 years ago, not even 5 years ago, that it could happen this fast. But once it takes off, it can exponentially increase. The good. We have tipping points that are bad. We also have tipping points that are great. and people can help make those tipping points. So here's a headline that if we do everything we know we need to do today, this is a headline for December 2030. California is the first state to reach net negative emissions, kickstarting the nation and the world into equitable climate action. March 2035, drawdown and resilience are increasing despite record-breaking drought, thanks to climate-friendly natural and working lands management. And here in the elections, it's election day, or the day after the elections in November of 2040, the Global Climate Union authorizes 420 trillion in Healthy Planet Accords. We're on track to get back to 350 parts per million and a safe climate. Ecosystems, the economy, and our communities are healthy and resilient. Soils and vegetation are sequestering carbon at scale. Wildlife populations are recovering. And the Sunrise Party wins the presidency. I won't be surprised if that's actually the headline then. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our conversation together. I will stop my share right now.
I tell you, that's incredible. That's incredible. Well, I have one quick question, because one of our core activities is habitat restoration, and I would love to learn more about your ideas on a habitat restoration corps.
Yes, yes, it's so, I keep thinking about different ways to engage, especially young people, but we could create a jobs program that could work with landowners, public and private landowners all over the state, to do the kinds of habitat restoration efforts that are needed, climate smart habitat restoration. At Point Blue, you may be familiar with the STRAW program, Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. And as of a couple of years ago, they had engaged something like 50,000 students over the years. And I imagine a program like that that's modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, but doing it for habitat restoration in a climate-friendly and appropriate way, where you could really scale it up very quickly. Again, the limitation isn't that, you know, we don't know how to do it. It's really deciding to invest at scale. And just putting money alone won't work. We need the technological support, not the technical support, meaning the biologists and the people who know how to do it, to train others, and then train others, train the teachers to teach others, so that we can scale it up rapidly. So in my mind, I envision if we had to get, and my belief is that we need to get to somewhere like around 20 to 25 million acres restored or managed better. And that's essentially a quarter of California. It's an enormous amount, and it would take a little bit to ramp up, but if we could ramp that up, you could see how it could take off quite quickly. So that's a general description. The specifics are like in every habitat type. At Point Blue, from my experience there, we have a climate smart habitat restoration approaches for every different, you know, biome in California. And we also know that on working lands, on croplands, on rangelands, there are multiple practices. There's like 170 practices that are recognized by the Natural Resources Conservation Service for conservation, and probably about 35 that are really our primary practices for carbon farming and that kind of approach to have a dramatic increase in sequestration and water holding capacity, sustaining biodiversity, and improving it ecologically.
We have one comment that one of our attendees is sharing, who expresses concern that if Governor Newsom were to be recalled, that would seriously hamper our climate change efforts. I don't know how to address that, but I thought I'd share that comment.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely, but you never know. But we do have to remember that whoever's at the helm, whoever's our governor, California has a super majority of Democrats in the state legislature. Even among Republicans, we have people who support climate action and support environmental action and conservation. And we know that it all goes hand in hand. And so I think Governor Newsom has talked the talk on climate. I think there's a lot more to do to really lead us for walking the walk. And I don't want him, I hope we don't have a recall, but he does need to hear from us. And we need to actively ensure that the people are speaking. We saw how the elections nationally in November, and then the runoff in Georgia, how a small number of people in every precinct turned the outcome differently of the election. And so every one of us can make a difference, not just in elections, but in policy as well. We have to actively speak out, and we can make it that difference.
Wonderful. I'm now turning to the Q&As, and our first question is from one of our attendees who says, I live in an old house with gas heating and stove. How do I electrify?
That's a great question. There are a number of places where you can, I don't know which county you're in here, and I'm imagining you're here in the Bay Area or in San Francisco, but there's a number of incentive programs through BayREN, if you go online. And if you can email me at ellie@theclimatecenter.org, and I can send you some links. So you can have people come do an energy assessment at your home for free. PG&E even can do that for you. And then you can start with BayREN, they have actual rebates for you to switch from gas heating or gas stoves. Now I have to say, I personally still have gas heating, and we almost did it this year, but it's very expensive to make a switch. And so, but we have switched our gas stove, so we hope to switch to electric water heating soon. That's our next step. So we can do it incrementally, but in the end, not everybody can afford to do that. And it's a great question, and that's why we do require all different levels of government to be part of this. And the only government that can make up money is a federal government. And so the fact that President Biden wants to spend trillions on a green recovery effort for COVID is exciting, because we can begin to use a lot of that money here in California to do things like supporting us to go from gas heating to electric.
Thank you. And the next question, it's a long explanation, but I think it's very well written, so let me read it.
Sure.
The power companies lobby for industrial scale solar and wind installations on public lands in the desert. This harms the desert cryptobiotic soils that sequester carbon. Do your goals distinguish between local solar energy on rooftops and the large installations on public lands?
That's an excellent question. And I don't think that our specific policy recommendations do, although we do call for decentralized energy. We strongly support, well, actually, I should say, yes, our policies do, but we don't have a specific policy against industrial scale solar. And we have discussed that recently. Our priority is decentralized, locally managed clean power. And the best thing of all would be solar on each roof and local microgrids, as I described. At Point Blue, we were part of a statewide effort to bring our biological and ecological data to determining where solar farms should be placed, so that they wouldn't be in places where that cryptobiotic soil, or where there was I forgot what it was called, but it's a riparian habitat, xeric riparian habitat, where there are riparian corridors, but they're basically underground. And those are the most important areas in the desert, any place that there's water. And so we didn't want them to be installing them there. And our recommendation generally has always been to do it only in just places that are already disturbed. So putting big solar on giant parking lots is a great idea. And protecting our public lands by not putting those there is also a great idea. And thank you for the question, and I will look into that, and I appreciate that reminder.
The next question is, this is another good one. We have some smart people. Thank you, everyone. Should owners of conventional automobiles sell them in favor of electric vehicles or wait till the end of their working lives?
That's a great question. I mentioned the Cash for Clunkers program. Older cars are much more polluting. And so if it is an older car, better to get rid of it and get a new car. If it's a newer car, it may be best to keep it until the end of its lifetime. There is some point at which it's better to do one or the other. And I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can try to find it for you, or you can look it up. And it depends on which car it is, how old it is. That may be the simpler answer. I personally have had an electric vehicle since 2011. And I'll never forget I live in Marin County, and the first time that I was able, we live on a north-facing hill and a small house on the border of Fairfax and San Anselmo. And we have tried several times to get solar. And this time of year, we just don't have any sunlight on our roof for just where our house is. And so when Marin Clean Energy came out with Deep Green, which is 100% clean energy, and Marin Clean Energy is our local CCA, a local community choice energy provider. That day when I could plug my car in and I knew that I was paying for 100% clean energy was one of the happiest days of my life until this week. Last 4 years have been a challenge, but I think that the sooner we can move to all electric, the better it will be overall. But it's, again, the older the car, the sooner you should move to electric.
And the last question, maybe you and I can just talk about what the answer might be. The attendee asks, how does GGAS tell how to maximize impact, i.e. determine how much will be done with how much effort? I think we can ask that question more regionally. What do you think would be a good answer for a small environmental nonprofit like ourselves for how to measure our own performance and how we prioritize toward a clean energy future?
That's a great question. I think that you are a respected voice locally, and that you should, you can work with, is your area mainly San Francisco? I just want to be sure I know what geography you cover.
Yeah, we encompass a few counties in the San Francisco.
Sorry, you just cut out. I'm sorry. So I'm assuming you're saying in the San Francisco area. So I would say that one of the things that you can do is to make sure that your local governments are actively engaged in pushing for accelerated climate action by the state. And the local governments will benefit from that because money should come from the state to support local climate action. And I think as an Audubon Society, that chapter, that you should also be really pushing for making the nature-based solutions equal to the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So I just want to be sure if I'm still there, and I don't know if everybody can hear me or not. If somebody could write in the chat if you can hear me, and just say, because I don't know who just got cut off. Okay, great. You can hear me. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Thanks. I see that now. Okay, that's great. And I can see the Q&A, so I can look at that and continue answering questions. So I think that the Golden Gate Audubon Society should, for me, my belief is that change happens through government policy, through people pushing for government policy change. Those policies change, they unleash market and societal forces, and then you can move towards a climate safe, environmentally safe future for all. And so I think setting up some clear policy goals as a chapter and working with your local governments to achieve them and to put pressure on the state to do more is one way that you can do that. Another question I have here is, does the Climate Center address the human population problem, a root cause of natural resource use and carbon dioxide production? So we do not directly. We focus on California state policy. And I will tell you that there are a number of studies there. Most of the science definitely indicates that we have too many people on our planet. But the truth is that the vast majority of the impact on our planet from climate change, from habitat destruction, comes from the more developed countries, from those of us who live in California, frankly. And now we have the situation where most of the people in the world want to live like we have lived and how we live today. And if we truly shared resources equally, there are studies that show that we absolutely could have even more people on our planet and restore much of our planet and much of our ecosystem health. But that isn't the way it works. And we have too much consumption of goods, as that one study I referred to in my presentation mentioned. And it's definitely a huge issue. There's no question. But personally, we don't have a policy on it at the Climate Center. Again, we're focused on state policy overall. But one of the policies that I referred to earlier about women being educated, this is something that's one of the, maybe the #1 climate solution in drawdown globally, is to educate young women and girls. And that has to do not just with, not about reproductive rights, but it's actually about educating them, and people who are educated have fewer children. So anyway, it's very interesting. It's a complex topic, and I appreciate the question. One more question I see here. And Pam, I don't know if you're back, but I'm just reading the questions here.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm back. I'm so sorry. I'm glad you kept things going. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no worries at all. This is from, we are in Western Alameda County and San Francisco with a lot of East Bay people. I see. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for explaining that. I mean, there's great things happening in Berkeley and San Francisco. And I just ask that we, with our local government, that we use local government as a tool, not only to be on the cutting edge of great policies like Berkeley and San Francisco are, for example, on banning natural gas hookups in new buildings, but also on pressuring the state to do more and to act faster and to bring more money to local government and to local communities. Another question here: what policies would accelerate distributed solar faster in California? Well, we had a 1 million solar roof policy that I think was originally envisioned under Governor Schwarzenegger, that was realized over the last couple of years, which is phenomenal. But other policies could require that every building have solar, or every building, like again, at my house, it wouldn't make a difference, but that every building that is, that can utilize solar have it, that every parking lot has solar, that we use disturbed areas, industrial areas, to put solar in it, and battery backup. There's all kinds of policies. The microgrid, we have a series of policies we're working on with partners on clean energy local microgrids. And one of the key policy areas there is it's not passing a law in the legislature, it's actually getting the California Public Utilities Commission to change some of the rules that take away the monopoly from the investor-owned utilities like PG&E. And many of their decisions at the CPUC are in favor of the utilities. We want it to be open so that small distributed energy resources, which is really meaning small providers of clean power. So it could be a person who has extra solar on their home, or it could be a small business somewhere that they can sell to others. Right now, my neighbor across the street, who's in sunlight all the time, is not legally allowed to sell his extra electricity to me. We need to change these laws that were put in place 100 years ago as we were expanding and ensuring that the transmission electricity system served everyone. We now need to decentralize it. So there are a whole range of policies that could be implemented, and regulations that need to be changed to make that happen. Um, Another question here. How can we get people to stop sitting in parked cars with the engine running? Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I hate that. I guess a lot's about public education. One idea that here in Marin County, we have a group called Resilient Neighborhoods, and they are working to, they basically offer a free program for people in every city in Marin to learn about how they can reduce their carbon footprint. And part of that is learning about how when you sit in your car, in your gas powered car, and leave it on, that's not a great idea. And so part of it is education. I've always envisioned myself that we could organize by precincts in the state, basically by neighborhoods, and that we would have precinct leaders who would be basically your emergency preparedness coordinator for your neighborhood, who would essentially be a climate leader who would be responsible to organize with other volunteers in every single neighborhood in the state to educate people, to get them engaged in taking local action right on their street. And part of that would be learning about what we shouldn't be doing. So that's just one idea. And another question here, does COVID-19 have, this is a great question, thank you, have a positive effect on climate change that is sustainable after the pandemic? I believe that it does. And there are so many lessons from COVID-19 that apply directly to climate change, and certainly for environmental conservation. I mean, we know that COVID went from a bat to another animal to humans, and it is completely because of habitat loss, and that wildland urban interface just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so that wildlife interacts with people in a way that they didn't before. So we know that we're going to see more and more pandemics if we don't start protecting more habitat and keeping people out of habitat. We know that because of COVID, however, we have seen several things. We've seen the positive tipping point side. What we saw this past year, in 1 year, this was unheard of before now, that because of investments from governments all over the world, including under Trump here, companies developed a vaccine. Several companies developed a vaccination to this pandemic, to this virus. And so many people said a year ago, the fastest anything like this has ever happened has been over years. And so the fact that that happened so fast shows, again, if there is political will and you put the money into it, things can change fast. A year ago, we were told in Washington, D.C., there's no extra money. And weeks later, there were trillions of dollars to be spent to help people, to pay for research. It can be done. So incredible parallels to COVID. And for me, it gives me a lot of hope as a great example of how society can change quite quickly. Another example is not perfect, but lots of people wearing masks. Certainly when your president is not promoting that, it doesn't work, but President Biden is now requiring it in all government buildings and public transit and other places, and setting the example. And we can see how human behavior can actually change very quickly when you have science behind it and when you have leadership. So great question, thank you. Another question, how open are farmers to carbon farming? That's a great question. More and more farmers are seeing the impacts of climate change on their lands, especially with increased drought. And the farms and ranches that are implementing regenerative management approaches, they can see, they'll have green grasses or green vegetation in August and September, late into the year, before the rainy season begins. And they can see the difference in the quality of the soil, and even in the replenishment of groundwater in places where there are groundwater basins, like primarily in the Central Valley. And so I think it's shifting. but many of the farmers and ranchers that I had the opportunity to work with through Point Blue, where during my tenure, we worked with almost 1,000 farmers and ranchers on 1 million acres to implement conservation ranching and farming, and for birds and for other wildlife and habitat and sequestration and soil health. There were many people we didn't walk in and say, talk about climate change right away. We would really talk about what are their needs on their lands, but everybody has the common interest of water, water quality. The need for water is the basis of everything. It's the basis of life. You don't get sequestration in nature without water. You don't get biodiversity without water. We can't live without it. So any ways that we could change how the land is managed to increase natural water holding capacity, reduce their costs for having to bring water in earlier in the year. So it's, again, an education effort, and with more leadership, with more money invested, more of what I refer to that technical assistance of having experts or just trained people who can work with landowners to explain what's possible, and giving incentives like financial incentives to do the right thing, I think can turn people around very quickly. Let's see. I think that's it, Pam, unless there's any other questions from folks.
Thank you. You've been so generous to answering all the questions and managing everything so perfectly when my connection failed. I apologize, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience and staying through to talk with Ellie and learn more about how we can do this at a grassroots level as well as the state level. That's
Well,
really
thank you.
exciting.
And thank you all for the great work that you do. I am a birder, an amateur, but I love it. And I love nature. And I love the things that you all stand for and are committed to. And one of the things I've been very honored to be able to do is to, through my work at the Climate Center, bring my passion for nature and ecosystems. And this Climate Safe California campaign is the only one we know of that brings together dramatic greenhouse gas emissions reductions with nature-based solutions. It isn't one or the other. We need all of it. And right now, the climate movement and the environmental movement in California is very siloed. But to do what we have to do, we're going to have to find that common ground. And we're all going to have to work together across sectors to do the big lift, because it's huge. But we have to do it to secure a healthy, equitable, vibrant future that is still possible for us to accomplish.
Well, yeah, before we go, I just want to share with you and remind all our supporters and listeners that we completed our strategic plan, and our first strategic initiative is a call to action on climate change. So with your presentation and this new engagement, I think we can strengthen the information we have on our webpage and more boots on the ground, take more action with our habitat restoration, and maybe do a more targeted outreach, like you say, to incentivize folks who might be interested and just need more information and more guidance on how to participate. So
That's
this
fantastic.
is wonderful.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, everybody. Feel free
Wonderful
to reach out to me.
Thank you so much. Have a
good
wonderful evening, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye for now. Bye.
Bye-bye.